For those, my name is Florian Martin Barreto. I'm an associate professor of law at the Faculty of Law Criminal Section, and I'm the director of the Center for Law, Technology and Society. And so I'm delighted to welcome you today for the 2023 annual equality convention. So without further ado, I will hand over to Barry and Professor Steve, so like two faculty members at the Center for Law, Technology and Society. Professor Bailey is a full professor in the Faculty of Law Community Section, and Professor Steve is a full professor in the Department of Criminology in the Faculty of Social Sciences. And together they lead the Equality Project, which is a SHRC-funded research partnership with community members. And so they've been doing a lot of work with youth and digital context in the past years, and also the interaction with like AI and tech. And so this is, I think, what they're gonna like share with you today and like start the conversation on this topic. So without further ado,
it works. Hi, as Florian said, I'm Valerie Steves. It's really a pleasure to be here today. It's particularly a pleasure to be in a room with people who can actually eat food, and I'm really glad that people are joining us from the internet as well. So Florian mentioned that what we wanted to do today was talk to you about the work that we've been doing to try to take the lived experience of young people, give them an opportunity to articulate it so policymakers can understand exactly what's happening on the ground and craft better policy. In many ways, this entire initiative grows out of research that I've done over the last 20 years with kids around their experiences with network tech, some of which I've done with Jane. So, over the years, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, last week, whenever we sit down with young people, it's really obvious that there is this serious gap between the way adults talk about the kinds of problems kids have online and the way that kids talk about the kind of problems they have online. Typically, adults go right to the online predator and safety. And since kids are at risk, the solution is always surveillance. But when we sit down and talk to young people about their experiences, they tell us over and over again that actually surveillance is the problem. They're under surveillance from their parents, surveillance from their aunts and uncles and their brothers. They're under surveillance from their teachers, and they're under surveillance from the companies that own the platforms that they use. So we've been thinking about how to bridge that gap for a long time. One of the first things we tried in this regard many years ago was Ian Kerr and I created a youth panel at one of the Revealed Eye conferences here at U of O. And it was a great venue because we had 5 kids who could speak with a lot of authority and experience about what was wrong for them online and how the surveillance affected them. And the audience was full of privacy commissioners and people who work at the OPC. It was so successful that I got asked to repeat the panel at the national meeting of all of the privacy and information commissioners across the country. And it was really interesting to see how it shifted policy. Typically policymakers will go, man, I work with this stuff, I look at these issues, but I never really got it until I heard what it feels like on the ground. So when Jane and I started EQ about 12 years ago, which is a long time for a 7-year project. But when we started EQ, we were really committed to doing work that would bridge that gap. It was really important to us. So as Florian mentioned, EQ is a SHRC-funded partnership, and our main focus is on learning more about young people's experiences of privacy and equality in network spaces. Because it's a partnership, we've been privileged to work with a wide range of groups, including educators and policymakers, and I'm missing some, and youth workers, but we also have youth partners. And right from our very first meeting, our youth partners have underlined how important it is to take kids seriously, to treat them as experts about their own lives, and to give them ways to express themselves so they can set their own agendas and start to push back against the surveillance that's being imposed on them by adult policymakers and corporations. Since all of that research is also grounded in an understanding of privacy as a human right, as a social value, something that goes well beyond data protection principles and is directly implicated in the way we form our identity and our ability to form healthy relationships, it was a natural jump for us to start looking at the child rights literature. So if you look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example, Canada, as a signatory to that convention, is obligated to provide kids with ways to enjoy their rights, their right to privacy, their right to enjoy their culture, their right to media, their right to express themselves, their right to assembly. All of these things are which are implicated in online spaces. So Canada is obligated to provide kids with that opportunity. They're also obligated to protect kids from harm. That's certainly an important part of the puzzle. But from our perspective, most importantly, they are obligated to ensure that there are ways for kids to participate in decisions that are that affect their lives, that are meaningful to them. So, you know, in the policy work we've done, for example, Jane and I both participated in the UN review of Canada's compliance with the CRC in the last round. And it's, to be fair, you know, they're doing a little bit on provision. They're doing a little bit on protection, but there's almost nothing on participation. So it becomes even more important if we're going to recognize young people as experts in their own lives and as rights holders, that we figure out how to bridge this gap so policymakers are in a position where they can see and hear what young people are trying to tell them. So our first kick at the can. As I said, we met with our youth partners. They said, you know, get in gear and take this seriously. So we started to explore youth participatory action research methodologies. We were approached by a group of young people that were working with Val Michelson, then at Queen's, now at Brock University. And Val and I worked with this group because they were interested in doing their own research. They wanted to be the ones to kind of drive the new knowledge that they were creating in their participation in Queen's research projects. So, you know, we sat down, it was a heck of a lot of fun. We worked with them and helped them figure out a research question. We helped them design a methodology. We collected the data. We worked with the analysis. We wrote an academic paper. Check, 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 check. And at the end of it, they said, and they participated in all of it. You know, we gave them the opportunity to author with us if they wanted it, all these kinds of things. So we tried to be really youth-centered. And at the end of it, they kind of looked at us and said, is that it? We sort of, well, that's what we do. Well, that's their job. And they said, no, no, no. This has been an amazing opportunity for us to learn about how technology impacts our connection with ourselves and our connection with other people. And they did this through a methodology that allowed them to disconnect from technology for a week. And they said, we want to make sure other people, other teenagers like us, have an opportunity to do this. So they came to us and said, we need to make a challenge video we can stick up on YouTube. So we got the funding, we hired the filmmaker, and they made a challenge video. Well, the first thing that happened was that the press loved it. So yeah, Jane and I have been on CBC for the odd 10-minute thing. Yeah, we just came up with new research. This is what it says. You put these kids who are designing their own research project and creating their own knowledge, and adults took notice. They were interviewed on radio. They were interviewed on television. They were interviewed by paper journalists. That's an anachronism now, but you know what I mean, newspapers. And there was, and it lasted for 2 or 3 weeks. We got calls on this, and a lot of this stuff is still up and referred to by people. I do a lot of public speaking at libraries and things like that. Everybody out, every now and then someone will go, hey, weren't you involved in that disconnection challenge? So it was an excellent way to get more visibility about the issues that matter to them. But because one of our partners was the Alberta Teachers Association, when Phil McRae saw what was happening, he said, oh, wait a minute, this is fantastic. I want to give every kid in Alberta a chance to do this. So the young people and Jane and I worked with Phil to create an Alberta-wide challenge. It went to every single school in Alberta, and in February of 2020, just before we all disconnected from life because of the pandemic, over 11,000 kids took up the Connect Challenge for the next 5 years. So when Jane and I looked at that, we thought, wow, we get way better results when we're not driving our research. And when we are putting kids in a position where they have a lot to say about what we're doing. So we started to explore other methods, and to a certain extent, we started to move away from research as a paradigm. We wanted to create methods that took kids out of being the object that was, being put under the microscope and then looked at and analyzed and talked about by adults. And instead, we wanted to come up with methodologies that enabled them to express their own concerns, put them in that driver's seat, as I was saying earlier. So today we just want to walk you pretty quickly through two of our favorites. I think it's fair to say that they've been the most successful, and just give you an opportunity to see what we've tried and then the kinds of results that we've gotten from these two different approaches. So the one I'm going to talk about is the arts workshop. Jane is going to then talk about our youth summit. Now, the art workshop started because we were sitting down brainstorming with our collaborator, I guess, Chloe Joras in Puerto Rico, saying, how can we create a space where kids really get a fair chance to say what they actually think without it being shaped by adult discourses. And Chloe works with art as an artist herself. And we started to look at art as a method that would allow us to provide this kind of space to young people. So the first thing you got to know is that this is not education. The art workshop is not like our other educational modules, which you see on the screen. We do a lot of privacy and equality education. We think it's important. These are the kinds of modules that get into schools and sometimes libraries. And if we're lucky, they get into community groups, like one of our partners is the Y. So they'll use this kind of material with their groups of kids. When you're doing it, though, the fact that it's education shapes what you can do. For example, a half girl, half face video, which is still one of my favorite things we've ever done, was produced because when we were doing our first conference with e-girls, we were approached by a young filmmaker who had a young playwright, I guess, who had written and performed a fringe play about what happened to a young girl when her face went viral on the internet. It was a fantastic piece of work. We loved it, particularly because it really illustrated all of our results from the research that we've been doing for the past 3 or 4 years before that about, how gender is performed and constrained in network spaces and the consequences when kids are placed in this surveillance environment. So we approached her and said, what we'd love to do is we'd love to take your play and turn it into a 15-minute video so we can get it into schools. You can't sit down with kids in grade 11 and say, let's talk about your terrible experiences on the internet, because it's too personal. You need to give them something to talk about, right? So it was a wonderful way to give them something that reflected a lot of the experiences that we had heard about in our own research with young people, so they could discuss it perspective and how to themselves anyway. So it was a great project, loved doing it, had to go into schools. First thing we had to do is take out all the swearing. So you've got this really weird situation where you've got kids from the age of, 3, out on the internet where you might notice people swear. I don't know, maybe you've never been on the internet. It's not a white bread place, and they're dealing with this, they're living out there. But when we want to talk to them about it from an educational point of view, we're really doing two things. We're trying to steer them into behavior we like as adults, but we also want to do it in a sanitized way that they look at and go, you guys are out to lunch. That doesn't really reflect my experiences. So when we started to do the art workshop, the first decision we made was that it wasn't going to be an educational initiative. And the reason we did that is because we wanted it to be really kid driven. I mean, education, like I said, we do a lot of it. It's really important to do. This is not, the schools do an amazing job under the constraints that they face, but we wanted to do something a little different to create this new opportunity so they could make their experiences, their needs, their desires, their dreams, their concerns visible to the adults around them. So we created a workshop. Sometimes it was a 2-day workshop. Sometimes it occurred over a long period of time. Some days it's a 1-day workshop. So we had to be flexible because we were always working in partnership with other organizations to deliver this to young people. To structure the workshop, to give it shape so they have something to hold on to, we created what we call the imagination primer. Now, again, this is not so we can go, kiddies, these are bad things to do on the internet, and these are bad things that happen on the internet. It's to give them a common language to support their own informed discussion from their own perspective. So part of the primer is just setting that language out there, looking at examples, drawing quotes from our qualitative research, which are the voices of young people their own age, to sort of set the stage for a commonality among them when they sit down and say, okay, what are we discussing? We know what we're discussing. Oh yeah, we've all seen that, let's talk. But the other thing we did is we drew on examples where young people had used art in really creative ways to challenge inequality in network spaces and surveillance in network spaces, just to kind of act as a primer. To say, okay, we're going to have this, you guys are going to have this conversation. Then you're going to design a project that's going to speak to the issues that matter to you. Here's some cool things other people have done just to get you going on your own. So our first workshop, still my favorite, I have to admit, though it's hard to pick your favorite child, right? We took place at St. Stephen's House in Toronto. They were an ideal partner for us, primarily because St. Stephen's is located in Kensington, works with a highly diverse number of communities, or a number of highly diverse communities, and typically is working with kids who have been economically marginalized and marginalized in other ways. So it really fit with our commitment to intersectionality as a project and to community outreach. So when we first approached St. Stephen's, they said, yeah, we've got this art studio in Kensington, but the story is really interesting. They were working with young people from all across the city, many of whom came from impoverished circumstances. And they noticed that a lot of their kids were really good at art. They had a lot to say and they had a lot of skill. So they really encouraged this, and they got to the point where, you know, people were looking for something to do after high school, and they encouraged a number of them to apply to the Ontario College of Art, and they didn't get in. So they did it the next year and they didn't get in, and they thought this doesn't make any sense. So they called the Ontario College of Art and they said, hey, what's up? These kids are really talented. Why aren't you even giving them a call back? And they said, oh, we didn't even look at them. To get through our process to apply, you have to give us a portfolio, which costs about $1,000 or $1,500 to put together. These kids didn't have that money. So St. Stephen's partnered with the Ontario College of Art. They got free space in Kensington donated to them. It's a beautiful studio full of light, and they've got lots of materials that kids can use there. And then professors from the art college come in and teach and mentor kids as they're developing their skills and help them put together the kind of portfolio that will create opportunities for them once they're finished with high school. So ideal partner from every way possible for us. So we had this workshop, we went through the process. This was a 2-day workshop. So we were there for all day Saturday, all day Sunday. I cannot underline how important the food is. There was lots of really good food, but it was really a lot. Some of these kids knew each other, some of them didn't. We were working with a youth leader that has incredible skills, who's actually become one of our main filmmakers, who's also a really talented and award-winning filmmaker on her own right, Andy Villanova. And it was fascinating to watch us step back and then build community around these issues. And the Saturday was devoted to the conversation. And I have to say, I think that was the best conversation I've ever heard young people have about the impact of technology. Intersecting with race, intersecting with gender, intersecting with colonialism, intersecting with poverty. It was a really phenomenal conversation. So this is one of the pieces that came out of this 2-day workshop. So I was talking to the young artist, and she obviously the focal point is the beautiful, strong brown body in the and gendered female body in the middle of it. And she said, yeah, I placed her in this cloud because that's sort of like the internet. You know, it's so amorphous. You can't get your feet on the ground. It doesn't exist, but it does exist. And I wanted to show how she was pushing the world up back into the stars, where there's clarity and there's beauty and there's opportunity, and we can do creative things with it. And I'm looking at it, and then I realized Jane and I don't know why, but we took a bunch of wire. And we had a big spool of sort of coppery wire there. And she grabbed this stuff, and she started by weaving it into the bottom of the screen of the picture or of the painting. Thinking, she was thinking about connectivity and the wired world and all these kinds of things. And then she pulls it up from the back and she punctures through the body of the girl holding up the world. All across the waist. That's not just wrapped there, that's punctured through the body. She then takes it up and wraps it around the left wrist and punctures the wrist, weaves it around the world, sort of containing it within this networked connectivity, and then wraps it again, punctures the right wrist, and takes it out the back again. And I asked her about that. She said, oh, that's because she is she's kind of like paying the price to hold the world up, to create better opportunities for us in these network spaces. So incredibly evocative piece of work. And I don't think we would have got to that level of her thinking about how all these intersections came together unless we had approached it this way and given her opportunity to design something that was meaningful to her. Our second kick at the can was down in Puerto Rico. This was a long-term project because we were working with Chloe and a number of her friends down in Puerto Rico who are professional artists. And so they got together and they went through the imagination primer and they had the talk and looked at all the issues. But then they came back 3 times, I think, where they were mentored by the artists. So they would come back and say, I'm thinking about a project. What do you think? The artist would give them input and help them in developing their ideas. And then as they constructed their projects, they had this ongoing input from really, really talented professional artists in their own right, who also work at the intersection of race and gender and ableism and all the things that as a project we're interested in. So this, I think, is just amazing. This is a piece of work that was done by a young woman who is Puerto Rican. You might not know, but at least at the time when this was made, all of the American Armed Forces camouflage uniforms were made in Puerto Rico with this print. So she got this big piece of fabric liberated from the factory. And the first thing she noticed about it was that at the bottom of it, it said, copyright United States, Navajo print. And she was really looking for ways to bring in colonialism into her artwork that looked at surveillance and gender and all these other things, and how technology disembodies people. So she had been holding on to this fabric for a while. She had some ideas what she wanted to do with it. Then when she started working with the workshop, she thought, wait a second, this is a great way to talk about surveillance. So she took the print. It's hard to see from the pictures because they're taken off the video, which you can see on our website if you're interested, of all of our workshops. She put a wire circle and hung it from the ceiling and then wrapped the fabric around it. So the dark camel side is out and the light camel side is in. So the camel colored one is in. Now you can see from the picture on your left that there's a bright light. So she's got it hanging from the ceiling and then she put a really an uncomfortably bright light, painfully bright light right over the space. And then you invite people to walk into the circle. So you come inside the circle and you're under the surveillance of the light, and it's very uncomfortable. Then she took embroidery floss and she embroidered quotes from Derrida, another theorist, and then her own thoughts about surveillance, militarization, colonialism, and these kinds of things. But she picked the tan colored thread. So in this incredibly painful environment, you have to look really carefully and strain your eyes to see where she's embroidered these messages on the cloth itself. When you're in there, you're also asked to put your body parts through the holes. So that's this picture here. There are two young women standing in it, and they have their arms through the armholes like this. And what she wanted to do was create a visual way to convey how when our lives are taken up by these systems and turned into data, and then we're reconstructed as data objects, we come together in uncomfortable, but also uncomfortable ways that don't fully reflect the wholeness of what we are as people. This project was also really exciting because we were able to exhibit the art at the Diagonal Studio in Puerto Rico, and it was open to the general public. So it was a really lovely way to ensure that the creative work that was done by this group was made accessible to the public and became an accomplishment for them. I mean, Jane and I look at this and go, man, we could not get to that level of abstraction, of sophistication, of provocation, just doing research. I mean, we did actually there's a video where we talked to all the different artists from the San Juan Project, and they do talk about these issues, but this process created a space where I think they could create really meaningful and important representations of how surveillance shapes their lives and how inequality is experienced in network spaces. So we've done other workshops in Toronto, in the north of Toronto with New Canadians. We've done another one in San Juan, where one of our young artists, Jane's daughter is an artist. I'm taking her as part of our, because she also works with our project. But she went down and she trained other young, like teenage artists on how to do the workshop so they could take it back to their communities and do it with groups of kids in their own communities. And most recently, we've done an art workshop also led by one of our young artists with the Ottawa Art Gallery, which is the Cube, just outside of Yuval. I'm sure you've all seen it. Mm-hmm. So, the reason we love the art workshops is we think it's really a unique way to make young people's experiences visible. If you're interested in getting this to a youth group or a school club that's looking at equality issues, a community club, a library, we've sort of created a how-to slide on our website, how-to guide on our website, hopefully giving other people an opportunity to replicate this method as well. So as I said, the OAG exhibit is actually tangentially associated with their youth summit. So I'm going to turn it over to Jane to talk about that.
Yeah, so to just sort of pick up on what Val was talking about in our sort of commitment of trying to imagine other ways of engaging young people and bringing forward their voice and ideas and recognizing their expertise. We last fall ran a youth summit where we brought young people together with policymakers to tell policymakers about their experiences with education technology, which was particularly fresh given the pandemic and the forced transition to online learning. So that the summit itself was modeled on what I think is, if you look in the literature, talked about often as a research methodology. We ran it as an outreach strategy. It brings together, the idea is to invert the relationship between researcher and participant. So that the participant runs the show, the participant sets the agenda, the participant leads the discussion and drives the discussion. And typically in a research setting, you'd be recording that and then you'd be analyzing it later. What we were doing here was because we found that when you put people in situations where they're being recorded and they know later being analyzed, the kind of conversation that you have tends not to be quite like the conversation you would have if it felt like more of a natural conversational setting. And so we decided to run it as an outreach methodology. So we wanted to put kids into conversation directly with policymakers. We wanted to position them as the experts that they are. And we wanted to position policymakers very much as listeners in hopes of a lot of different things, right? You always have lots of aspirations. One of them is to make young people understand and recognize themselves as experts, as participants, legitimate, important participants in democratic processes, which often is not the case. And to create a situation where they not only hear that, but that they experience it. Hopefully, if you set the parameters correctly. So the summit itself happened almost exactly a year ago to the date, and it brought together 30 young people from Ottawa and a few from Toronto, who had been recruited through various sort of mechanisms. With 4 into this space here at the University of Ottawa. There were 4 facilitators who were also young people who were sitting with the youth and the policymaker to help facilitate the conversation. It was important to us that they were also young people so that they were identifiable to our young participants. And we had 4 note takers. Now, both the facilitators and the note takers, all of whom were young people, many of whom are in the Faculty of Law and were in the Department of Criminology and had other connections with our project, were all trained by the Morris Wosk Center for Dialogue at the SFU in British Columbia. So it was an online training, and part of that was to ensure the facilitation in a way that welcomed the youth and made them comfortable and confident. But also as part of going back to what our youth advisors had told us, right? You recognize young people as experts and compensate them, right? Don't just take, which is what researchers tend to do. And so the idea was that this training itself then becomes a line on your CV, that you are trained in dialogue facilitation. And so that was another thing that was important to us, in addition, obviously, to compensating them for their time. We had 5 policymakers there. The Deputy Commissioner, Brent Homan, from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, the Privacy Commissioner for Ontario, Pat Cosim, and then Assistant Commissioner from Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, Eric Ward. We had from the Ministry of Education of Ontario, Michelle Surti, who is the Interim Director of Curriculum Assessment and Student Success. And we had a representative from the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, who who is a retired principal and also happens to be my partner. So that's kind of the setup. Before arriving in the room, we wanted young people again not to be educated about the issues, but to have an opportunity to reflect deeply and think about how they wanted to prepare themselves to share their views and ideas once they got into the room. And so we created, using some of the resources that we had already had on our website, and also adding to them some that were particular resources that were available to them online. They could proceed through them on their own time. We provided a workbook so that they could do activities as they sort of went along. So to help them to formulate their viewpoints and to think and to have the time to think about what it was that they wanted to say. Before they shortly before they attended the event, we had an online icebreaker with some of our youth facilitators that was just designed to sort of help those who wanted it to make some social connections before entering the room. So it's a kind of a nice transition into the larger space. The day of the summit, we ran according to Chatham House rules, and we told the participants what that meant, which was that while the content of what was said might be reported later, it would never be attributed to any particular person or any particular affiliation. Again, that was important to us to ensure that people felt free to express their views. We kicked the day off after obviously a land acknowledgement, because we were, as we are today, on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and we want to reflect a little bit on what that meant and the significance of Ottawa as a meeting point from time immemorial. And so we talked about that and the land that we were on, and then we transitioned into a screening of a film called #Trust Dancing, which is also available on our website. A film by Sava Sahali Singh that was commissioned in part by Equality Project, AI and Society, and the Surveillance Studies Network. And it focuses on an ed tech subject, a sort of a near future, slightly dystopic situation where a young woman named Frankie is given the opportunity to make up for the fact that she has failing grades in math by wearing some augmented reality ed tech glasses. And as the plot unfolds, we see that she loses control of the technology and finds herself in a position where she actually has to choose between succeeding in school, getting the grades, academic success, and her friends. And so the young participants had already watched that film, but we wanted them, as part of preparation, but we wanted to have a common group experience where the policymakers sat and watched the film with the participants as a way of kicking off the event. Then the remainder of the day was divided in two. In the morning, we had a morning session and an afternoon session, where dialogue was led by our youth facilitators, and they had prompting questions that were really there not to direct discussion, but to start the ball rolling in case that was necessary. I can tell you, actually, I'm not entirely sure there was any need for any prompting at all. It was incredibly, the activism and the wisdom and the participation of these young people was really quite off the charts from my perspective. Again, it was emphasized that the young people were leading the discussion, that they could engage with the policymaker at their table as much or as little as they wanted to. They were in the driver's seat, and the facilitator was just there to sort of make sure that things moved along. And if there were pockets of quiet, which really there weren't, that there would be someone there to help move the discussion along to the next point. Policymakers were told in advance, and were like a wonderful group of people. We had such an amazing group of policymakers, that they were there to listen, that they were there to witness, and not to drive conversation. Our note takers were not there to write transcripts. They were there to sort of record points of consensus and points of dissent. And one of the great things about deliberative dialogue is that the point is not to drive to a consensus, to some forced consensus, but to initiate a dialogue where a variety of viewpoints can be put on the table. The young people afterward were compensated for their time, both in preparing and attending at the event, and also were given, to the extent that those who needed it, we were able to sign off on volunteer hours. They had a certificate of completion, again, as a part of emphasizing the recognition and their compensation for their expertise, and the role that they played. So as I said, we had a morning and an afternoon session. These are the prompts that were used that were there for the facilitators if needed in the morning session. Essentially, again, easing into, what do you think of when you think of ed tech? What is it look? What is your experience? What sorts of ed tech do you use in school? How would you describe your experiences? And then sort of eventually easing into the discussion in the materials about how data is collected from these kind of applications, and whether or not they had been familiar with that prior to the reviewing the materials, and to get their sense of how they felt about it. So that the morning and the afternoon were kind of broken up by lunch and a trip to the Ottawa Art Gallery to view the artworks that have been created by the artists in the Ottawa Art Workshop that Val mentioned earlier. So we were able to, these young people then were able to interact with sort of artistic expressions of some of the issues that they were actually talking about in the dialogue. Then in the afternoon, the focus then started to be directed toward algorithms and sorting people into categories and their perceptions of what categories they thought they might be sorted into and what impact if any, they might think that has on their education, how it might affect their various relationships with teachers and with one another. So one of the commitments that we've made is that we would write a report from the summit so that the summit doesn't feel like a one-off experience that young people were sort of invited and then business as usual, nothing is ever actually done. And so our report is near to finished. Our plan is to disseminate widely, and in particular to policymakers, to encourage people to engage and to make change that reflects lived experiences of young people. Just to give you a sense of some of the kinds of things that were talked about as we sort of reflected on the notes that the note takers had provided us with. In terms of privacy and surveillance, there was a lot of discussion around those issues, as you might imagine. There was discussion about choice and consent. which I see some of my students in the room, they know are two of my favorite is topics. And so I wasn't leading discussion. It just comes up, right? It's not just me. They talked about the fact that they didn't really have choice to use these technologies, and that any discussion of this as somehow them consenting doesn't even make sense because of their lack of choice. One of them said, we don't have a choice. It's not consent. It's not even as if I could consent since we started using EdTech when I was in 7th grade. Another said, we don't have the option to opt out. If you don't opt in, then you can't go to school. So the sort of mandatory nature of the technologies was a real feature conversation. In terms of the sort of intrusiveness of technologies, there were discussions about the discomfort that comes with sort of mandatory cameras on policies, for example, but also the sense of needing to have your notifications on, when regard 24/7, and the kind of strain and constraint that placed on their lives. One of them said, I don't want to miss anything because notifications are key. Everything is thrown to you 24/7 and you have to juggle. Yeah, okay. Well, we all know what that these are some of the realities of life. It doesn't make it any better or any more palatable. Another thing that came up a lot was the lack of transparency about what the technologies were collecting and what was being done with the data. And our participants really talked about being very frustrated and sort of wondering why there seems to be like sort of no information about this, so that they could understand what was happening and actually, maybe raise questions. So one of them said, they don't tell us what information they get. They ask parents if they can take our photos, but privacy and data is secret. And why? Great question. They recommended consultation with users and noted how important it would be to have disclosure about what was being done with technologies, and to talk about some of the limitations of particular technologies, and sort of this sense of being always on. There was a good bit of discussion around mental health. I think that like many of us are having in the post-pandemic world, and we're having in the midst of the pandemic about that arises from social isolation. Some of our participants were concerned that the lack of social interaction had really undermined their social skills and their social interaction skills. They talked about their discomfort with the blurring between school life and home life. One of the participants said, I don't even want to go in my bedroom because there is the dreaded technology that I use every day. I don't know how many adults in the room can identify with that, but I certainly can. They talked also about strategies for coping, because one of the things that you find when you talk to young people is no matter what ridiculous things adults seem to throw at them, they find a way. And they shouldn't have to find a way. The point isn't, here's this horrible world, go be resilient. But the fact that they have these strategies and they're coping is really amazing. And one of the things that was heartening was that some of them talked about sort of going to trusted adults in their lives when things got difficult. In terms of relationship, really mixed accounts of the impact of technology, of EdTech on relationships. Most of them said they communicated with teachers generally by email, which I know is the most ancient of technologies. And for some, that was great because they found it easier to communicate in that way because they could sort of think about what they were going to say. Others found it very frustrating because of the delay in response, so that the kind of input they needed just wasn't timely from that approach. There were some stories about schools and teachers looking at young people's social media use and sort of condemning certain kinds of chat discussions and so forth, and concerns about where the line ought to be drawn between what the school should be able to do, look at, and talk about, and what they shouldn't. And some of it, one of them used that sort of like a riff on, you know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and said what's in the group chat stays in the group chat. In terms of peers and friends, again, a mixed response to what kind of impact technology had with respect to those relationships. Some felt it was they had actually built relationships with people they might not otherwise have connected with because of the technology. And because for a lot of people in the pandemic, they were feeling very disconnected and looking for opportunities to engage. For others, they really missed the in-person interactions. One of them put it this way: high school and university is a whole experience. You meet people, and after class, you grab coffee and you talk to your friends and you share experiences that are priceless. And online, you close your laptop and you move on to the next task. It's lonely and it's not worth it. And I think, again, I think a lot of us have probably experienced over time in our interactions with digital technologies. There were conversations about access to and use of technology, which I won't say a lot about, except to say that one of the observations was that, well, the transition to technology because of the pandemic, once we sort of moved back into in-person sessions, there were some questions about whether there'd been a lot of thought given to whether we just should continue on using the technologies, or whether it was an opportunity to reevaluate what needed to be done online and what could be done in other ways. And at least one person was craving alternatives like pencil and paper for subjects like math, and feeling quite constrained by the presumption that certain things needed to be done through technological platforms. So one of the things that we did on the day of the summit, and then with some interviews, I think afterwards as well, and some interviews afterwards, was to sort of get some observations from people who participated, and to have them talk to us a little bit about what their aspirations were. I was going to play you, and so we have a wonderful video that's been created by filmmaker Josh Lyon from Ganakwe. Unfortunately, the audio and the video are so out of sync that I can't tolerate it, so I'm not going to play it. But what you would have heard, importantly to me, were sort of some conversations by policymakers about the impact that being involved in this process had on them, and also some comments by our facilitators about how they hoped that policymakers had learned from what the young people told them, and that they would go back and do some more research, and that they would be sort of motivated to think more in the future about the integration of young people and young people's experiences in policy making in this environment. In terms of that book, by the way, was not the voice of the person who was depicted there. That's why I chose not to say it. So that at the end of the day, we're very near the end of the equality project, which is sad in a lot of ways. I think it's fair to say that I hope you felt from our enthusiasm that we really feel that sort of artistic engagement and methods like deliberative dialogue are really powerful opportunities for centering and honoring the experiences and the expertise of young people, and to engage with their internationally recognized rights to participate in things that are that affect them and are of importance to them. We hope that the process inspires other people to engage with these methods. As with the art workshops, we'll be developing a series of lesson plans and modules that will be on our website and made available in other forums once the project is over, that hopefully will inspire other people to engage with these methods, to bring them to their community organizations, their classrooms, their book clubs, whatever the case may be. We were inspired by the fact that some of the participants in our workshop actually went on to become members of the Youth Advisory Council on the Provincial Privacy Commissioner, which is amazing. And some contacted us to say that they would like to lead dialogue in their own schools using the hashtag Trust Dancing film as a springboard for conversation. So all that's really inspiring to us, and we hope that the work will carry forward. I'll say one of the things that I'm thinking about now is the potential of deliberative dialogue in technology policy spaces more generally, in part because where most of us are made to feel like we don't belong in those conversations because we don't have the expertise to understand. And thinking about deliberative dialogue as a mechanism for communicating that members of the public who aren't sort of trained in engineering or computer science have important, valuable things to say about the values that should be instilled in policy in this area. And it's a particularly ripe time for that as Bill C-27 gets back on in front of the industry committee this week. With that, I want to thank you for being here and sort of open it up if you have questions or comments for either or both of us. Thank you for your time. Any thoughts, questions?
What is your report coming out? You have lots of thoughts on what could be done, needs to be done. What is the biggest challenge in getting policymakers to take the time to listen to youth in the decisions they're making? Is it that they don't have the time, they don't know how to do it? Is that they don't think youth are smart enough to speak for themselves? What are the challenges that you see that kind of need to be overcome to get those recommendations put into place or to have their voices heard more regularly?
I can say I don't sort of have that I know the answer to that, but one of the things that I observe with respect to consultation is that one thing about young people is that policymakers think, well, I was young once. I know what it was like to be young. Like, I don't have to ask young people to know what it was like to be young, right? And to me, that creates a certain barrier about whereas that there's some sort of assumed common experience and also a sense that, yeah, and when I was young, I really made some, like, you know, I really didn't know what I was doing and made some bad decisions. And so I feel like that's a component of it. I don't know what you would say about it.
What I would say is that like you'll notice that the people in the room are mostly commissioners that are using it, right? They have a mandate, they have an interest, they've got a budget. This is right up their alley. It's much harder to talk to legislators because legislators are under a whole bunch of pressures, primarily to promote an innovation economy that frees up AI. And the way you do that is you get the kiddies in early and you get all their data and, you know, all that kind of stuff. I would say the hardest thing is pushing back against the discourses and the reshaping of what kids say by corporations. And I'll give you an example. One of the best things that's happened in this field is the General Comment 25 on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Colleagues of ours in England and Australia led this. It was based on research that was done all around the world and not just in the West, all around the world with kids. It's very, very child informed. It's provocative, it's thorough, it really analyzes the impact of that surveillance economy on kids. And it's very critical. It's a great piece of work. So to turn that into legislation, the Office of the Information Commissioner, Denham, when Canadian Liz Denham was leading the UK office, she worked very hard on creating the new age-appropriate design code, which is now legislation in the UK, California. They're trying to push in Canada. And you take all of this really rich, critical conversation and you push it into a thing that's okay for companies. So I was in a meeting in London last December talking to a lawyer who works for these companies about the age appropriate design code and why aren't you on board and how can we get you on board? And we were having a conversation about the best interests of the child. So there's a big struggle right now because child rights advocates and children and human rights people want it interpreted as the best interest of the child. Facebook has already given their kick at the can. I refuse to call them Meta. I'm sorry. I just find that totally obnoxious. So Facebook has already done their kick at the can, and guess what it ends up as? Parents, watch your kids. They could get in trouble. It's all on you. And you have to consent to everything. So they drive everything back to data protection. And if you look at the age appropriate design code, one of the strengths and the weaknesses of it as a model is that they're attempting to legislate the best interests of the child without articulating what it means or how we figure out what it means. And I think there's been that right from the beginning in this area, there's been that push and pull. COPA in the States, Child Online Protection Act or whatever it is. It was started by Catherine Montgomery as a protest against the manipulative and deceptive kinds of interactions that young people were experiencing on commercial websites at the time. And it was turned into data protection. You look at the GDPR tries to infuse human rights language and limits itself with data protection. So I actually think we're in the same structural problem when it comes to creating the privacy regulation. And that's why all of our work was founded in very much informed by our research, actually, but in an understanding of privacy as a social value and human right, not an informational right. It's not about data, it's about people.
So in that case, it has nothing to do with kids at all. They're just like another facet of how it shows up.
Yeah, I think so. But I think kids, it has a weird thing to do with kids because right from the beginning in Canada, kids were, you know, those early adopters. They are innovators. Just, you know, they don't want regulation. They want corporation. I've listened to Facebook in panels on kids' privacy. Kids want us to be left alone so we can create the software that they love, the opportunities that they love. You talk to kids, they have lots of critical things to say about all of these platforms. Yeah. So it's kids have been the poster child for innovation, and it's driven a lot of policy, which is really weird because it's always don't regulate, kids will innovate and make us rich in this new world. Oh God, they can see porn, put them under surveillance. Oh, for heaven's sakes, they're mean to each other. They're a problem, put them under surveillance. you know? So kids have been implicated in the whole thing from the beginning in really weird ways. But yeah, I think it's a larger problem.
Yeah, it's a really difficult push and pull.
Yeah.
Between and it's hard to, because the platform lobby is so well funded and it has such consistency of interest. It becomes very easy to put that agenda in front of policymakers, whereas all of our agendas are disparate and we don't know where to turn to find the opportunities to say, no, we have these communities of interest that need to be listened to. So there's a real power struggle there that I feel like ordinary citizens are losing in the battle at this point in time. Even if you think about the the preamble of our privacy legislation, the whole thing is really oriented toward let's give people just enough so that they trust these systems so we can, gather data and make ourselves rich. Right. So there's that economic imperative that's always driving. And kids are a real focal point of that because they're seen as they're the future face of this. And one of the things about getting ed tech in schools is sealing people in early to particular kinds of ways of doing things.
Google Classroom.
Yeah.
When I was talking to that lawyer, we got to the point where we were looking at examples and I said, for example, with ed tech, just don't do that. Don't collect their data and stuff. And she said, but we can't make money doing that. And I said, I don't care if you can make money. It's child rights. It's about the best interest of the child. And she literally closed her book, like literally. And that was the end of the conversation. So that's where we are. Thanks.
Do you ever see differences in how kids inform policies when you divide them into like kids who were newly introduced to technology versus kids who grew up with technology? Because I know now the youth of today, they did not know a world without your phone, without your iPad, without your there's no pencil anymore. It's like Apple Pencil. So do they have like a different perspective when it comes to informing like tech policy?
To be honest, that's our research agenda. So I'm not speaking about this. I'm going to our research findings. I'm amazed at how consistent the critiques of technology are. And yeah, there are kids. So I talked to kids in Toronto not that long ago, and they had just started high school and they were so mad. Microsoft had given them tablets. They were mad at Microsoft because they had this stupid tablet. They knew they could be placed under surveillance. It was in their house, all this stuff, but they were told they were only allowed to hand in their homework if it was done in this software and delivered through this tablet. And all of them were doing math on paper and then copying it into this thing to try to get it into and they were furious about it because it doesn't matter if you were born three years ago doing math. You do it on papers. You do it on paper. It's not a linear form of thought, right? So these are kids that grew up with technology and have been in schools that have been wired right from the time they started. And yet they had the same complaints. In fact, they had stronger complaints than a lot of the kids that we talked to 15 years ago, because 15 years ago, they weren't being forced to do a lot of this stuff.
Oh yeah, and it's what I always find really fascinating about the whole discussion is that things are always painted as all or nothing. Like, this is how technology is, take it or leave it, which to me is so contrary to innovation. It's kind of like, well, why can't we have it all? Right? Who's decided we can't have it all? And young people feel that. And often when we talk to them, you can see they feel that, but you can also see that they feel they'll be called naive if they say it. Right. And so so we often get comments like, it's not fair, but that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Right. So there is a level of resignation to it, which I don't equate to acceptance. It's just sort of like, you know, you can't fight every battle all day, every day, all the time, right? But to me, it's this lack of imagination that we have to have a model that's premised on scraping people's data and profiling them. Because that's the way companies have found to make money, that now that's the only way that we can that's the only digital environment that we can have. To me, that's not innovation. I don't know what it is, but it's not innovation.
I would also argue that there's a policy failure in this approach, because so first time I was involved in doing quantitative work for kids was 2000, and how old were you in 2000? I don't know if it was you or not. I can't do the math publicly quickly enough. But you know, kids said they love the internet. You know, adults couldn't find them anywhere. Their parents were completely stunned out. They didn't have any idea. They were exploring the adult world. They were trying new identities. They were pretending they were different kinds of people. They were having a great time. And when we asked them, what do you think of corporations that, you know, do all this stuff? They'd go, oh, they're my friends. If you see a .com, that's my friend. So that's 1999. Pipit has passed. 2000, 2001, it's in force. It's like, yeah, we don't really like how this is working. 2004, they're talking about dirty old men in companies that are watching them all the time. What's wrong with them? 2010, they're really angry about this. When was the last time we were really in the field of EQ? 2017 or something? You know, we've given up. We have no hope because corporations are horrible and don't listen to us. So I see that as I constantly argue with policymakers. That's a policy failure. Data protection is not getting them trust, and it is not helping the kinds of outcomes that we want. In fact, I'd say it's doing the opposite.
So would you say their approach to policy would be more individually curated so that they can have like more space to create options for them to use this tech?
You mean kids? And Jane used to say this. When I met Val, she always said kids talked about privacy, but I assume that's because Val wanted to talk about privacy. And then I went in the field. They see it as a privacy issue. They want to be able to control who sees what about them. They want to be able to put up walls between their audiences. They want to be able to say things that disappear. They don't want to be held to account for some stupid thing they said when they were 14. If I was held to account for what I said when I was 14, I would not be here today. You know, that kind of thing. So they, it's not about give me privacy. And then the tech companies go, we'll give you privacy controls that in fact make you more transparent, not less transparent. So it's a bait and switch kind of approach. But it's give me lived experience of privacy. Respect my privacy. I've told this story before, but I love it. Talking to a mom, and she was saying that her daughter had gone to a party Friday night. Cops were called. She was a teenager. Cops were called. Something happened. She, you know, and so, you know, her daughter's sleeping in. And you know, she's got a good relationship with her kid. Her kid's a good kid, and all the moms are, hey, what happened? Oh, you know, I heard this, I heard that, and all this. So she, when her daughter gets up, sits her down at the kitchen table and says, "Okay, tell me what happened last night." She said, "Forget it. I'm not telling you. I don't need your help. It's none of your business." And so they have that conversation for a while, and she goes, "Well, I don't know why you're not telling me, because all I have to do is read your best friend's blog, which her mother's already done, and I'll find out exactly what happened." And her daughter went, "How dare you? That's private. And if you do that, I'll never trust you again." And I think that's a really important story, because from the teen's perspective, it did not matter that the story was available on technology that was visible. What mattered was the relationship. If you look at that, I will never trust you again. And the mother said, "Fine, I will not look," and did not.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. We need to stop here the conversation because there is classes in that room right after. But thank you so much, Jane and Val, for sharing your research with us today, and for everybody to be in attendance. Our next event is next week, October the 4th, on AI and digitalization. You can find all of the information on our website and please, when you leave with some of the food left, and we look forward to like to another events.